Thanks, Las Cian Corla. And thanks to the Electoral Commission for their work on the boundaries. I think there are significant problems with the outcome, but you can't really blame them for it. They're just the ones implementing the process that have been designed elsewhere, in particular here. Their hands have been tied by the decision to restrict constituencies to between 3 and 5 seats. And the consequence is the current proposal that we have that will pass and will come into effect for the next general election. One of the very good aspects of electoral politics in Ireland is the use of proportional representation. That is a very democratic way. It's not like in some countries where you have, minimum votes, 3% thresholds that have to be 3% or 5% that have to be crossed in order to get into the Dáil. It means that smaller parties, different viewpoints, have a much better chance of being represented within the Dáil. And PRSTV allows for, generally speaking, getting reasonably close to mapping on the vote of people in terms of support for different parties onto then the makeup of our Dáil. But the higher number of small seat constituencies that you have, the further away from that you're going to go. So I think it is regrettable that you have an increase of 4 of the number of 3-seat constituencies, which are obviously, by definition, the least proportional. I think it's in the interests of the big parties in this state, but also particularly historically now the second and third party, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, to oppose that, because it kind of has meant historically that, well, one of them gets one each and then maybe someone else gets another one, or they might get another one of the third, and the losers there are people who are voting for, who are trying to choose alternatives, which then in turn, smaller parties having a chance to be elected, having a voice in the Dáil, in national politics, then gives the opportunity of going further, and more people saying, okay, yeah, that's the kind of politics that I want to see. So I think the increase in the number of 3-seaters is very problematic, but I understand that the Commission was working within a certain framework where they have to deal with the geographies and the political geographies, and then only having available the tools of 3, 4 or 5-seaters. I think that the Dáil needs to deal with. I think we need to expand to say that there can and should be 6-seaters, even 7-seaters, which will result in more proportional outcomes on a national basis as well as on a local basis. Another point I want to raise, I do think that this process is one of the few kind of areas whereby an important, very important decision about public life is made. And that's basically it. It comes here, but nobody's going to amend it in reality. It's made by the Electoral Commission. They go through the figures, they do it, they publish it, and effectively that is it. Whereas you have a planning decision, in lots of other areas of life where council decisions are made, kind of preliminary decisions are made, they're put out to the public, people are able to make submissions on them, and then any mistakes can be rectified. You look at the process in terms of Bus Connects, where Bus Connects, they publish the maps, there's uproar in many areas. Then there's a process where Bus Connects has taken on some of those criticisms. There's been campaigning around it and so on, and there's been some element of a two-way process. It's very, very far from perfect, but there is a real public participation. Whereas in this process, you get one go, the public gets one go to have a submission. You can make a submission on national or a particular constituency or whatever. Then they make the decision, and that's it. And I do think it creates space for mistakes to be made that, if they had the opportunity of hearing feedback, may be rectified. But there is no opportunity here for a rectification of those mistakes. And I think these people are working at a kind of bird's eye view, looking at the overall numbers, looking at the electoral districts, looking at moving people around, but they can't possibly have an intimate knowledge of all the different communities across the state and how they integrate with each other. And that means, like, I think mistakes are made in terms of breaking up natural communities where natural communities don't naturally fit into electoral districts. And I think that's pretty important. You know, almost nobody in the state knows which electoral district they live in. It's not something people think about. They might know what council ward they're in. They probably don't even know that. They probably know what Dáil constituency they're in, unless they're in one of these areas where they switch from one to the other. But people know that they live in Swords, they live in Blanchardstown, they live in Tipperary, they live in Athlone, they live in Tala, they live in Rathfarnham. There are communities that people live in that are not identical to the electoral districts that we have. And I think when the Electoral Commission is operating without that real two-way process with communities on the ground, and then effectively comes up with a decision that, to all intents and purposes, is a final decision, I think that's a problem, because I think it can result in communities effectively being broken up. And I give you an example that I think is it is a bad decision that was made, is to break up Tala. They're taking 11,000 people in what is the Fettercairn electoral district. The majority of those people who live in Tala, a minority, live in City West, which are distinct areas, although they're one beside each other, but they are distinct, and people would identify as living in City West or living in Tala. But they're taking, let's say, 7,000 or 8,000 people who live in Tala and taking them out of the constituency of Dublin South West, where the whole rest of Tala is in, and putting them into a different constituency of Dublin Midwest. And I think that is a problem, because these people go to school in Tala, go to doctors in Tala, use public services in Tala, use public transport in Tala. It is Tala that they identify with, more so even than identifying with Fettercairn or Brookfield or Ardmore, or, you know, that people identify as living in Tala. And that's not just some abstract identification. They have real material interests and connections to this geographical place called Tala. And now they're being shifted out of the constituency, which still has, let's say, 4/5, close to 4/5 maybe of Tala left in Dublin Southwest, and into a different constituency of Dublin Midwest. And, you know, I have every confidence, People for Profit has a TD in Dublin Midwest. We are confident that we'll campaign and maintain that seat in Dublin Midwest, and I have every confidence that Gino Kenny will represent those people in Fettercairn very well. But there are dangers that communities effectively get stranded and left behind, where the main focus of people representing people in Dublin Midwest can be, you know, this is a constituency of Clondalkin, of Lucan, of Palmerstown, and basically Tala gets forgotten. Or that part of Tala gets forgotten, because they aren't represented by the TDs who are representing most of Tala, and the other TDs just don't necessarily, isn't really on their radar. They don't live in Tala, they're not connected to the issues that are affecting people in Tala. So I think that is quite problematic. I think you're also going to have a major issue with people. It will be on the day of going to vote for many people that they'll realise that they've been moved constituency, and they don't recognise this, because they'll see all the election posters for Dublin South West because they spend their time in Tala, and they will see some other posters but not really register that these are for different people, and maybe they'll get different leaflets, but people don't really engage with this stuff, and it will literally be when they go and vote that they'll discover that they're already all of a sudden, from their perspective, in a different constituency. I mean, I've spoken to loads of people. Nobody knows that they've been moved to Dublin Midwest for the next general election. So I think it's a problem. It's something that has happened previously. The previous speaker referred to River Valley in Swords. So this is a big housing estate in Swords that was taken out of Dublin North and that was put into Dublin West, with exactly the same kind of dynamic, whereby the majority of Swords was still in Dublin North, but then you had this bit of Swords which all of a sudden was in Dublin West. And that was reversed. That was reversed in the previous one, I think. It was clearly a mistake, shouldn't have been done, but now it's been repeated again. They've done the exact same thing to Tala in terms of taking out the same sort of proportion out of Tala and giving it to a neighbouring constituency. I've not much question that it will be reversed in the future. The demographics will shift in such a way, and they'll recognise that this is a community, it makes sense to have it in one place, but I think it highlights. It's not just that mistake, it highlights a problem with the process, where I do feel that, like, if we had opportunities, the public had opportunities to make submissions in relation to this, they would have been flooded with people saying, wait a minute, Tallow's one area, it should stay together. And I think like saner heads would have prevailed with the benefit of that local knowledge, whereas we don't have the benefit of that process at the minute. Just finally, I finish shortly in relation to some of the projects of research, which I think are very useful. I think the question of reducing voting age is very important. I just think it's a slam dunk case that we should reduce the voting age to 16. You can go to work, you can pay taxes at 16. Why shouldn't you be able to vote? I just don't think there's any good argument against it. I think the main argument against it that people have is just those people, we don't really trust what they're going to decide. That's democracy, and I think it should also apply to 16-year-olds, 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds as much as it applies to those who are over 18. The other issue is the issue of posters, which I think is research definitely worth doing. I would urge the research to also, as well as considering the option of restricting the number of posters, I'd also encourage discussion of restrictions on the material of posters, which may deal with some of, we're talking about cardboard posters, we're talking about plastic posters, and that's the current dominant form of election posters that are erected across the state. In general, I think that I've seen the argument made that actually having no restrictions on posters is a benefit to bigger, richer parties because they can spend loads of money on posters. But I do think you'll find that the things that are, posters are expensive, don't get me wrong, but the things that are really, really expensive is your bus stop ads or your bus ads or your, you know what I mean? And I think the danger is if you go towards restricting one of the cheaper forms of advertising, that you actually end up benefiting those who have big pockets and who can pay for much more expensive forms of advertising. I do think there are potential models, like in many European countries, you have big boards in the centre of different residential areas, and there's space allocated, and you can put up your posters and so on. But I do think it is a democratic, it assists the democratic process, I think, for people to see posters up, to see that there's an election happening, and for people to have the opportunity to have, election messages, ideas, slogans, whatever, of people on posters. And I think it is one of the cheaper forms of election promotional material. The other thing that I would encourage is to consider further restrictions on election spending. I think that is a thing. I think one of the problems actually is that the restrictions on election spending only kick in when the election itself is called. So there's nothing to stop someone spending tens and... Is it changed? 60 days, okay. But still, you've still got a whole period up to that where there is no... But we could have annual restrictions on advertising by, by any potential candidate or whatever, to avoid lots of money, because obviously an election doesn't just happen certainly in the 3-week period, but even in the 60-day period. Yeah, okay, I'll check it out. So I would also encourage that, because I do think in general lowering those limits, or certainly not raising them in line with inflation, would generally have a good outcome. That's it. Thanks a lot. Okay.